All right, good morning. Today we're going to be talking about the Boxer Rebellion. This will be our continuation of kind of looking at imperialism in China. Yesterday, you guys should have watched the videos on the Opium Wars. This should have been a refresher, hopefully, as passed those out before, but also should have helped you kind of get a better feel for what exactly the European involvement in Asia and in particular China looked like, and how we kind of get to the point where they start to dominate what used to be a central power in the world. Also, hopefully you guys appreciate the nature of that story and the fact that the Opium War effectively is the equivalent of the entire nation of, like, Mexico declaring war on the United States because we don't want to sell crack cocaine to our people. It's a weird moment in world history, to be sure. And then following from that, we come to the Boxer Rebellion and kind of the progression of imperialism in China and why exactly they themselves do not become a world power, given the fact that they were so wealthy. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today, this idea of the ever-increasing inequality in China and why they experience a fate similar to other parts of the world when it comes to the age of European imperialism. So with that, here we go. So just to kind of preface all this, after the Opium Wars, right, China is not in a good place. And it's not just because Britain showed up and kicked their teeth in and forced them to allow their people to become horribly addicted to a hard drug. Like that is its own problem, and it is only one of many. The Qing dynasty as a whole had a bunch of problems going into the 19th century. For starters, government corruption was a huge issue that they were experiencing. For example, the way that China had for a long time now decided who their government leaders were going to be was through something called the civil service exam. In practice, it was actually a very good idea. The way the civil service exam worked was that if you wanted to be a government official, you basically just had to pass this test to show that you were an intelligent and critical thinking individual. Previously, and in Europe, if you recall, a lot of times it had been appointment based. So like the king or the queen or the empress would say, all right, you are going to be my advisor for finances because I like you. You're my cousin. You seem like a cool dude. In China, the civil service exam had been designed to make sure the most qualified people were in a position to make those decisions. However, by the 19th century, the civil service exam was less a test of intelligence and more a test of how much money do you have to throw at the examiners in order to bribe your way into a political position. So very quickly, the government had become occupied by people who were not qualified, but rather were just wealthy enough to bribe the examiners. On top of that, in the late 1840s, we see the Yellow River flood, and like flood real bad to the point where it floods massive amounts of farmland. And while that in itself is already a problem, it is exacerbated, it is made worse by the fact that at the same time we see a massive population increase in China. They increased to almost 430 million people in their country, which, to put that in perspective, that growth was about a 30% growth in about 60 years' time, which is just absolutely unheard of. So there were a lot more people. There was not nearly enough food being produced. And then on top of that, with the flooding, what food was being produced now was destroyed. So like you had government corrupt that didn't want to help people. The average person was kind of starving because there were just too many people and not enough food. And then on top of all that, we have that opium addiction. With this as the backdrop, right? The fact that people don't have food, the government's super corrupt. You also have Britain just shoving hard drugs down the throat of the average Chinese individual. That's just like walking up and being like, hey, you want a good time? Here's some opium. Try it. Get addicted. It'll be great. And all of these things kind of start to create a situation where rebellion against the Qing dynasty is very appealing because, they're not solving the problems. All of these things the government is supposed to be responsible for taking care of, and it's just not happening. So our first dabbling with rebellion is not actually the Boxer Rebellion. It's something else called the Taiping Rebellion. And it's important because it kind of builds up to the Boxers. And so what had happened is that the Qing dynasty, right, is failing the peasants as a whole. The average Chinese citizen feels abandoned during this time period because they're starving, drug addictions are rampant, like, and they just don't seem to be doing anything. It's not very reassuring. And one particular guy feels the full brunt of all of the problems in China. His name is Hong Xishuan, and he is just like the quintessential example because Hong initially is a smart dude, and so he thinks to himself, all right, well, in China, right, if you want to achieve, you take the civil service exam, and if you're smart, you pass it, you get a good government position, and you can make change. And so he decides to try and take the exam, but he fails. And so he does it again, and he fails again. And he does that 2 more times. He takes the civil service exam 4 times in an attempt to get this position over and over and over again. He fails. And many times it appears that it's not necessarily because he himself was not an intelligent man, but rather the fact that he did not bribe the commissioners, and so they were not going to pass him because other individuals had. And so he feels this sort of deep sense of betrayal by the government here. While that is all going on, due to the fact that he is from a rural background, his whole family is suffering from the starvation that is rampant across China. When the Yellow River floods, his family is directly impacted. And so very quickly, this man is kind of put in a position of just feeling utterly abandoned. He can't pass the civil service exam. His family is starving. It really seems kind of hopeless. Now, with that sense of hopelessness, he's given an outlet, a potential solution to that, in that after the Treaty of Nanking, which, if you recall, ended the Opium Wars, one of the clauses was that Christians were now allowed to travel throughout China and set up missionaries and spread their teachings wherever they wanted. Previously, they had been restricted to a single port. Now it's all over interior China. And so Hong Xishuan becomes deeply invested in Christianity. He previously, part of the reason he'd been motivated to take the civil service exam was that he had repeatedly been having these visions when he slept. And in these visions, there was a bright light and a kind of shadowed figure who kept telling him to fight evil, to destroy evil. And so he had thought government service was the way to do that. However, it was starting to seem to him that the evil was actually the Qing dynasty itself, but he didn't really know how to fight it. However, after speaking with numerous Christian missionaries and reading a bunch of pamphlets, he comes to the conclusion that these visions that he was having, they weren't just any visions. It was, in fact, that the bright light was God, and that the shadowed figure was, in fact, Jesus, his elder brother. So Hong Xishuan actually decides that he must be the brother of Jesus, born much later than him. And like Jesus, it is his job to create a heavenly kingdom of great peace for the people of China. And to do that, the evil he has to fight against is the Qing dynasty. And so, now that he has purpose, he goes forth and he spreads that message. He travels throughout the surrounding area. He speaks to peasants and he preaches this idea of the king are evil, the king are unjust. Side with me and I will lead you to a more peaceful and greater society. And it's a super popular message. As you would expect, right? When someone is starving, is a peasant and is desperate, and someone comes around saying, look, man, I got you. Like, we're going to have this awesome new area. All you have to do is fight with me. You're going to be inclined to side with the fighting. And so he eventually gathers up around 1 million followers, and they lead a massive revolt in the area of Nanking. They capture the city, and he establishes it as the capital of his new China, his heavenly kingdom of great peace. And for a while, rules from there. Ultimately, it is short-lived. What ends up happening is that France and Britain, not super keen on this dude taking over the territory and creating his own separate China, in part because part of his purifying evil was getting rid of opium and making it illegal. Since they didn't really want to stop selling opium because nothing sells like a highly addictive substance, Britain and France send troops to go and help the Chinese government put down the rebellion. They ultimately defeat Hong's forces. He is killed. The city is returned to China, and everything kind of goes back to normal. But the problem is that as a result, you have a lot of fertile farmland absolutely annihilated. And so as a result of this rebellion, an additional 20 million people are going to starve. It's really great for like France and Britain because they get more influence in China because China seems weak. But China itself really suffers as a result. And so the problems that we had before are really just exacerbated or made worse by this Taiping Rebellion and the actions of Huang Xishuan. And so China is put in a position, right? The king is on a precipice. Their dynasty has to make a decision. Are they going to try and adapt to end the imperialist influence of the rest of Europe? Because right now it's just Britain and France. They have an opportunity. Or are they going to double down on the traditional Chinese way? And this decision ultimately falls to the current ruler of China at the time, the Dowager Empress Cixi. And unfortunately for China, Cixi sides with a half-measure approach. And if there's lots of lessons to learn from history, but one of the key ones should be that half measures really never work. Like, you really need to commit to what you're going to do when you want to make reform or things like that. And so what the Empress Cixi decides to do is she will not fully embrace Western society, but she does try and kind of pick and choose a few things that she likes. So, like, for example, she tries to reform the military, since clearly China is outmatched by the technology of Britain and France, and also to steal their educational system. The problem is that when she decides to do this, she hires a bunch of Westerners to come over and train the Chinese, but because she's only trying to reform the military, not also their economy, she lacks the production capabilities to meet the needs of these Westerners. And so what they end up doing is, like, they come over to the military like, okay, we're going to train you on the modern rifle. What you got? And they're like, ah, well, we actually can't make that many. We've got like 6. I'm like, oh my God. All right, fine. I'll order more. And so they start ordering more things from the West, more things from British factories and French factories rather than Chinese factories. And it just further indebts China to the rest of Europe. And it's wildly unpopular amongst the average Chinese people. Because, again, it's not solving their core problem. People are still starving. None of these reforms solve that starvation issue. It doesn't fix the food production of China. Instead, it just brings over more Westerners and more Western goods, which seem to be the source of the problem to begin with. These are the same people that are pushing a hard drug on their country, and now your leader is embracing them. Again, going with kind of an example, it would be the equivalent if, Mexico invaded the United States, forced us to legalize cocaine and sell it to our people. And then as the cocaine addiction is ravaging the United States, rather than fighting against it, the United States says, hey, Mexico, buddy, your military is a lot better than us. You want to come on over here and teach us how to do that? Come on, bring it over here. And it would just cause all sorts of uncomfortable situations. And so as there's all this unrest and weakness, Europe kind of smells that weakness, and they see an opportunity to expand their empires, to grow even more. And so you see more European nations going into China. There are more opium wars and more treaties that create unfair situations, where you have the Treaty of Tientsin creating more ports, allowing more interior travel, opening more areas up to European countries, as you can see on the map. And you also have the Treaty of Wangjia, which again opens up to the United States. And all of this leads to create spheres of influence in China, these tiny sections that you'll see in different colors, where they're not really, it's part of China, but it's not controlled by China. Instead, they're regulated by different European countries. Like if the United States was still a nation, but say like California was actually run by Japan, and Texas was run by Mexico, and North Dakota was run by Canada, and they had to follow Canadian rules and only trade with those Canada and only trade with Mexico. Like it's a bad situation, and it's super embarrassing for the average Chinese person. And all of this just creates the need for a second rebellion, a greater desire to try and fight against the Westerners. Anti-Western sentiment has become more and more popular. Average Chinese people continue to hate Westerners more and more. And so the government tries to solve this. The Emperor Guanghu attempts additional reforms. He tries to go super Western. He tries to make more factories. He tries to full-on mass-produce their own Western-style weapons in China. But this is where the Empress's half measures come in, where the Emperor tried to fully embrace Western society and basically say, look, we either get on board or we're going to keep getting abused, and we need to do that right now. But unfortunately, the Empress Cixi sees his actions as an attempt to usurp her because he doesn't run them by her at all. He just starts doing it, and so she has him immediately arrested and locked up to try and solidify her power as the Empress, and immediately reverses all the reforms, because even if they were good reforms that would help China, you can't allow them because then it seems like you're weak. You're letting the other guy make all the decisions. And so while it would have been great for the actual country, the Empress decides that, well, the country's not super important. What's really important is my own success. And so I'm going to need you to just kind of accept that you're not going to get any better. And as you would kind of expect, the people feel super betrayed. As you should, when one person puts all this effort into solving the problems that have been plaguing you for decades and then gets locked up and the keys thrown away, not really reassuring that your government's going to do what they need for you. And so this is where things really get extreme. Now, feeling completely and utterly betrayed, having suffered through massive amounts of starvation and years of inaction, the people have to look somewhere other than the government for reassurance. And that, in turn, is tradition. Many Chinese people start to look towards old Chinese traditions because they hate the Western ones. They want to feel some sort of comfort. And most popular out of all of these is the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, which gets abbreviated to the Boxers by Europeans. And these guys become extremely popular in rural communities. And their basic message was, Westerners suck, Chinese tradition is great, also getting pretty swole is pretty awesome. They emphasized a lot of physical fitness and old Chinese mysticism. And in particular, they had a very popular recruiting style where they would go and they would take a bunch of these boxers to these rural communities. They would show up, they'd rip off their shirts, they'd flex their muscles, they'd do a lot of impressive martial arts displays. And then when the local Chinese farmers would say, yeah, cool, that's awesome and all, but like, what happens when they shoot you with a gun? They would actually say, oh no, we are so in touch with Chinese tradition that we have come up with a way to be immune to bullets. And the Chinese people would laugh and say, that's ridiculous, you can't be immune to bullets. And they would say, no, no, watch. And they would put on these impressive displays where they would stand bare-chested and flexing while other boxers aimed rifles at them and fired, and there would be smoke, but it would all be blanks. And so they would act like they would shot, and they would kind of drop some pellets and be like, look, we are truly immune. And the farmers would all be, their minds would be blown. They'd be like, oh my God, these guys actually did it. And they would get more and more recruits. This should sound hopefully very similar to the Mahi Rebellion that we talked about during Africa, where they had the magic water that protected them from bullets. This is kind of a recurring theme, is as people get desperate during European control, and when there's that technological gap, they tend to turn to mysticism as a way to escape and give them hope that they can defeat these technologically superior enemies. And so the Boxers gain lots of support, and they start to progressively ramp up their actions, traveling across the Chinese countryside, executing any sort of Chinese Christians or missionaries, having these grand demonstrations of beheadings to try and scare off the Westerner. And all of this comes to a massive head in the spring of 1900s, where the Boxers officially make their move to try and overthrow the Qing dynasty and the Empress Cixi. It starts with a massive execution of Chinese Christians and the assassination of the Japanese representative in China. Japan and other European nations are horrified and demand that the Chinese government step in and try and control the Boxers. Initially, Cixi tries to send out the military to control them. The Boxers, however, have huge public support, and they charge into Beijing and storm the capital. These soldiers, not wanting to fire on their own fellow Chinese citizens, refuse to take action against them. Many of them actually side with the Boxers, and so the Boxers surround the foreign legation, the building, the walled area of the city that was for all of the foreign delegates to resist, and lay siege to it in an attempt to capture and kill the foreign devils, as they described them. And at this point, the Empress Cixi kind of backs off and refuses to get involved, kind of identifying that if she turns on the Boxers, that means the end of her own rule. Europeans see all this and are going to have none of it. They quickly form a coalition between numerous different European countries. Specifically, you see Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Russia, Japan, and even the United States join together to send 20,000 troops to China to fight their way to Beijing to free the trapped foreigners who they, at this point, had not heard from in a couple months. China and the Empress view this as a direct invasion, and it kind of solidifies this into a full-blown Chinese rebellion, with the Empress ordering the soldiers to fight against the European invaders and defend the capital city of Beijing. Unfortunately, the combined forces of the Europeans are more than China can handle. They put up a good fight, but the Europeans, led primarily by the Japanese, eventually break through, reach the foreign legation, and free the besieged Europeans. In reality, the situation was not actually as dire as it necessarily seemed. The Europeans were very afraid that there were going to be massive executions, but for the most part, the foreigners were unharmed. But at this point, the fate of China is sealed, and their role as an imperial power is over. They are at the whim of the Europeans. After the rebellion is put down and the Boxers are all executed, excuse me, Europeans force China to sign yet another unequal treaty, as they refer to them, known as the Boxer Protocol. And it forces China to pay $450 million in silver to these European countries as like repayment for the actions that they took. And more importantly, they are forced to prohibit the importation of Western arms. And so this will kind of solidify China as subservient to the European powers for the rest of the time leading up to World War I. Never again will they be able to really flex their might as an independent nation. And so there's a very important kind of lasting message about the fate of China, which is they made a poor decision in how to handle this period of imperialism. Unlike, as you guys will later see, Japan, they do not embrace this period of change. When given the option between either adapting and growing and trying to industrialize and kind of move into this modern era, they instead choose to try and fight back against the European oppressors and try to remain true to their own traditions. And so they fall to the same fate that the rest of the countries we talked about, that Africa, the Ottomans, all fall to, which is when there is a technological inferiority, especially in the military realm, at the end of the day, you just can't fight back until you've made some sort of progressive change. China doesn't learn that lesson from looking at Africa, and so they meet a fate similar to Africa, where they are forced to allow Europeans to trade in their territory and tell them what to do. and act as this sort of carved up chunk of land beholden to the Europeans. So that's the Boxer Rebellion and its impact on China. As you can see, really not great, suffering many of the same fates as African nations. Tomorrow, you guys will be reading about Japan and how their fate plays out. And hopefully you will note that it starts out very similar to China. However, they'll make a couple key different decisions that allow them to be one of those nations that is now putting China down rather than being abused by the Europeans, just like China. So hopefully you learn from that. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day.